Welcome to Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guest today is Jeff Riley, the Senior Director of the Americas Commercial Presales for Dell EMC. Jeff, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you, Jason.
Before we get started, let me set some context for our discussion today. 12 of the CFO Act agencies have met at least some or all of their data center goals for fiscal 2018. The Federal IT Dashboard says NASA, USDA, OPM, and SSA were among the agencies that met their goals for 2018. But overall, the government fell short in closing their tier and non-tiered data centers last fiscal year. In fact, OMB says agencies closed just over 3,000 non-tiered data centers out of a goal of over 4,000, and they closed 210 tiered data centers out of a goal of 471. OMB is updating the data center policy, we know that, and the goal of closures and optimization actually may be replaced by a new and better way to calculate costs and therefore savings when it comes to data centers. OMB is expected to take lessons learned from the USDA's Infrastructure Optimization Center of Excellence and come up with 8 different categories to calculate the costs of data centers. Now, one way agencies and OMB potentially could calculate the cost of data centers is how they move off legacy technology and move into the cloud, or at least a virtualized environment. Most experts in and out of government agree that agencies will continue to operate data centers and live in a hybrid environment for the short term. One example of this is DISA, the Defense Information Systems Agency. They've been adopting and deploying software-defined networks for much of the past few years. DISA says SDN will make it easier for services and commands to set up networks, deliver services, and ensure their networks are secure. So how do agencies take advantage of these technologies like SDN to modernize and improve their data centers? Well, that's where our guest comes in. Once again, Jeff Riley is the Senior Director of the Americas Commercial Presales for Dell EMC. Jeff, we should probably start at the beginning. Software-defined storage, technology, WAN, compute, you name it. What is that? Let's put a finer point on it for our audience.
Sure. I think you just gave a great example of how DISA is using it. It's about using software to abstract away from the limitations in hardware. So folks are needing to move faster and more agile, and by using software-defined technologies, you now can have the agility to reconfigure, repurpose, and redefine infrastructure as you go in a more agile manner. Before, we used to do it manually and have to do things in a very step-by-step function, and now software is making us more faster.
It's amazing the difference, right? You used to say, well, we need another server. Okay, let's call up Dell, right? And put in that server, and then it's going to take 6 weeks or 8 weeks or maybe less or maybe more. Now, if you need to spin up a server, or now if you need more technology in some way, you can just do it virtually. And that's the bigger difference.
Absolutely. Look, we've been under virtualization now for years. I remember when virtualization was never going to really be as adopted as we wanted it to, or thought to be so. Now, most organizations are 80, 90% virtualized, some 100%. So all of that has really provided us a way now to add infrastructure capacity on demand, be able to move virtual machines, operating systems, and applications wherever we need them to be based upon service levels or infrastructure needs.
Now, there's different kinds of software-defined technologies. There's storage, and there's networking, and there's WAN, and there's compute. Do all of them kind of come off the same idea of you can do compute when you need compute, or you need storage when you need storage? It's all the same concept, or is there a finer line we should kind of highlight?
Yeah, I think they all are under the same concept of utilizing software to manage the underlying infrastructure components. So software-defined networking solves that challenge of provisioning switches and ports and policies and VLANs and things like that, and makes it more agile from an operator perspective. The more popular thing today is software-defined storage, which is solving that challenge of being able to provision fiber channel SANs and networks and storage arrays and make that faster and simpler. Software-defined storage is abstracting the physical storage from the operating system and giving you a way to policy manage it and provision it quicker. So I think the same principles apply. How can I do things in a more agile, simplistic manner through software and get rid of the underlying hardware limitations?
Now, the obvious question. You ready? This is easy. Data centers. It's an obvious reason why you would move to SDN. We're starting to see that. We're starting to see this, if you will, evolution in many ways. Maybe talk about what you're seeing from your federal customers as they kind of change this data center construct.
Yeah, I think there's in my ecosystem, we have VMware as part of our portfolio, and they've kind of defined the software-defined data center under what we just talked about. It's utilizing software-defined networking, software-defined storage such as vSAN and other technologies to allow you to now have a full abstraction at a data center scale from the underlying hardware. So you can then utilize potentially anybody's hardware on top of that software and then no longer be bound by the limitations of the hardware vendor or the hardware capabilities. It's all defined, within the policies of the software. A great example of that is things like NSX or software-defined networking, where now I could take a virtual machine or an application and move it rapidly across what we call layer 2 in the data center, and have that happen at a much more efficient, scalable manner than we used to do manually.
When it comes to this idea of data centers as well, one of the things is agencies have been focused on hugging their server, right? Mm-hmm. The hardware side. And you're starting to see them move to virtualization. When I talk to CIOs, when I talk to the people who run the data centers, you hear this change is happening. From your perspective on industry side, are you still seeing requests for information or requests for proposals of people asking for hardware, or has many or most agencies moved into that software world?
Yeah, I think we're seeing more of, I think what you just mentioned earlier, which is cloud adoption and data centers being part of that cloud adoption strategy. So data centers now really are part of what we call a hybrid model. How can I run things on-prem where I need security, I need policies, I need to control my data? And how can I use the public cloud to burst capacity or put, quite frankly, cloud-native workloads out to those providers? So things like FedRAMP are helping us to really define that public cloud adoption and give us some sense of standards around security to do that. But what we are seeing is, within Dell EMC, we have a notion of modernize, automate, and transform. So for years, folks have been trying to really adopt new technology, new storage technology, faster server technology, things like that. And so modernizing is, quite frankly, refreshing from old to new and gaining some type of advantage. The trends now that we're seeing is how can I get into that automation layer? Because, we need to do things faster. We need to be more agile. That's where automation's coming in. So, automation in the sense the software is now giving us that way to create processes and tools and automated workflows so that I can go from a 14, 15 step process to provision a service down to a standardized workflow that'll do it for me in minutes or an hour, which is very different.
So there are three pieces to it, right? Modernization, automation, and then transform. Mm-hmm. We always hear the crawl, walk, run. Is this your version of crawl, walk, run, where first you have to modernize and then you can automate and then you can transform? Is transforming, still 3 to 5 years out?
Great catch. So the transform is where the real value comes in, that you're now changing how you operate. You're changing your people, your process, and your tooling as a whole to now, quite frankly, be focused on the outcome. So when you think of the federal government, it's how can I have more agile workflows and more change our actual processes of delivering those services, leveraging automation so that now I can be more rapid to deployment of those services, and quite frankly, change the services that we deliver, because now we can do things in a much more well-automated way. Great example of that is what we're seeing is something we call data being moved from due to Internet of Things. IoT is driving what we call the edge to the core to the cloud. So there's so much data and information across all the digital devices and sensors that are out there that data now has to be manipulated. It has to be analyzed and processed. It's being done out the edge. And then that processed data is moving into the core of the data center, where, quite frankly, we may want to analyze it in a different way, and it may be leverage cloud technologies to do that. That really brings new ways of operating a data center, operating IT as a service, if you will.
We hear that a lot, this IT as a service, and part of the reason we hear it is because of the cloud. And then you have places like the Air Force, as an example, who are looking at enterprise IT as a service. And is that the next step we're going to, if we can virtualize and use software to define our data centers and our storage and our compute, and then and our WAN and our LAN? Is the next step is this idea of you can just buy the service? Is that where you see it going?
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what consumers want. Consumers of IT is the attraction of cloud is to be able to have a portal where I define a service, I hit click, and I provision it, and everything happens underneath me because it's all standardized and automated, and that allows me to deliver that service much more rapidly. So the IT as a service is, if you own IT, then you have to think, how do I become a service provider? How do I become more programmatic and agile in delivering that service versus how we've done it traditionally, which is in silos of capacity and silos of technology. And then we constantly are dealing with refreshes of those silos.
And that's one of the biggest benefits I've heard around software-defined technologies is this idea that you can always update it. You can always be made better. And instead of saying, well, we just bought this box and we just spent money on this box, so we have to wait till the box has an end of life, whether it's a year or 5 years, versus this idea of, hey, we just bought the software and X company just updated it, do the update, now we're on the latest version. Is that probably one of the bigger benefits you're starting to see and see, but also agencies are starting to understand?
Yeah, great question. In that, one of the things of software-defined storage adoption is being able to no longer have migrations of storage arrays. So I now live in a software-defined model where if I want to change out the underlying storage technology, I can do that under the covers, and the software is managing where my workloads leverage, right? So I can offline storage, online new storage, and all that can take place totally transparent to the workload. And you think about the evolution of where we've gone from spinning disk to all flash, and now we're moving into an age of NVMe and storage class memory, and everything's about getting faster. You want to do that in the least disruptive manner as possible. So I think that's another aspect of the benefit of software-defined storage.
Another piece of all this is something called HyperConvergence, and maybe you should define what that is, because it sounds like something from Star Wars or something. But it's this idea of what?
Warp speed. So
you had to make the Star Wars reference, right?
To,
yeah, all right, fair enough.
Star Wars fan. So I mean, we've done 3-tier architectures for a while, like compute, network, storage, and we did something back in the 5 to 10 years ago where we got into what we call convergence. And convergence was, how can I make things more tightly defined into an engineered outcome, because it would remove the variables of differentiation, the patching and the updating and the chaos that goes on in the data center when you have 100 vendors and disparate technologies. So convergence was how to more tightly define based upon those standards and manage it more simply. HyperConvergence came along and said, hey, what if I took software-defined technologies, created a smaller packaging based upon server technology and embedded storage, and then utilized the software layer to be able to automate more in a more refined, tighter package. And the benefit of that was you wouldn't have to go spend tens of millions of dollars or $1 million on a 3-tier architecture and deploy it. You could now buy it at a server level acquisition model, and the software would allow you to add servers as you want it to go and be able to manage it at the software layer.
Is HyperConvergence on the bleeding edge, on the cutting edge, or is that being used now? Are you seeing it from customers requesting it?
I would say it's probably on its hype curve right now. So it's growing at 150% across most industries, and it's one of the hottest areas in the federal government because of the simplicity of deployment. So if I need to add capacity or I need to just get a workload out more quickly, HyperConvergence is a very easy way to do that. And so what we are seeing is it started out in what we call appliance models, and people buying 1, 2, 3, maybe 8 appliances. And now you're scaling it up to where you need a switch, you need to tie it into your network, and you need to make it bigger. So that's what we call rack scale HyperConvergence, and something we call VX rack. And that's just because you need to include the network, into the environment and plug it into your core data center. So HyperConvergence is growing quickly. It's all in the software and the automation, but you're really buying into a software strategy.
Is there one pothole or one mistake you see agencies or companies make when they jump into HyperConvergence? Is there something about it that you would say, before you do that, here's something you need to know?
Absolutely. You can easily get enamored by the automation and the simplicity of multiple vendors' offerings, right? And so you have to look at it as, what is my long-term vision around managing through software and getting into a hybrid cloud environment? And that's where we feel that being tied into a familiar operating model such as VMware and leveraging all those assets is going to give you that common layer of software management across hyperconvergence to convergence to 3-tier and then into the cloud. If you don't think long-term, then you could be buying on a short-term need and then kind of stuck in a silo.
All right, very good advice. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we can continue our conversation. You're listening to the discussion, Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Radio, part of the Federal News Network.